Grab your cup. I'm going to share a story with you today, a story of faith that created miracles, and it's a personal story from my life. And the reason I want to share faith with you is because I invite you to look at, where do you have faith in your life? In the Bible, faith is mentioned well over 200 times. Jesus said over and over, have faith. Everything I do, you can do. Have faith in me. And in the Bible, in both Mark and Matthew, it's referenced that in Jesus' hometown where he grew up, he was not able to perform the miracles that he did outside in the world, in other parts of the world, because the people in his hometown had known him since he was a little boy. They saw him grow up from a little boy to a teenager to a young man, and they were skeptical. They were like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's just a regular kid that grew up here like any other man, any other young man that's here. So the people in his hometown did not have the faith, and Jesus never performed any miracles there. They didn't happen. But when he left his hometown and he went out into other parts of the world, because of the strength of the faith, and that's what the Bible mentions over and over, have faith. It is what you have faith in that gets created. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. In fact, both the Old Testament and the New Testament talk about faith and talk about fear. Depending on what version you read, fear is mentioned between 300 and 500 times. Fear not. Have faith over fear. What you believe and where your faith is what you are creating in your life. And we were told that over and over. So as I share with you my personal story of faith and the miracle that it did create, I invite you to look at, where is your faith? Do you have faith in what you're afraid of? Do you put your faith in your fear? Please, I don't want this to happen. Please let this not be. Because if that's what you're focusing on and you actually expect, that is what happens, like the people in Jesus' hometown. If you have faith in believing that things that you cannot see, things that you have no evidence for belief in, can happen and will and do, then you start to create those kinds of outcomes. And Jesus said it over and over and over again. So here's my personal story of faith. It's around my daughter, Charlotte, whose picture is right there. And if you don't know about Charlotte, she passed away in 2019. She was 15 years old. We had her for many years more than the doctors ever thought that we would. She was born with a heart anomaly, and on the night she was born, she was given last rites, and she was rushed for an open heart surgery on that night. She had a second open heart surgery. She was the youngest kidney transplant that New York Presbyterian had done at the time. This was almost 19 years ago now. So at the time, she was the youngest. It was before her second birthday. And when she was about 2.5, she got RSV, which is a virus. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a virus that, if you're healthy, it causes a really nasty cough that can linger for a while and you feel pretty sick. For someone with an immune system that's been compromised from a transplant, it can be deadly. And for Charlotte, she sat on a ventilator, the ventilator doing the work of her lungs, because that virus settled into her lungs and made them so inflamed and so filled with mucus that she could not keep herself alive. And the ventilator was turned up to 100% oxygen. I'm sharing this story with you because I want you to really get how serious this was. 100% oxygen. So there's nowhere more for the ventilator to go in terms of oxygen. And the pressure, so the ventilator breathes in and it breathes out, right, for the lungs. It blows in and then it pulls out. The pressure was at its lowest because if they turned the pressure up at all, it blew a hole in the lung tissue. She had 5 holes in her lungs from being on a ventilator that they were working on healing because the lung tissue was so sick and inflamed. And after 11 weeks of watching this situation and being utterly afraid. And even with the help of the ventilator, Charlotte's lips were black from lack of oxygen. And the numbers, so the monitor is measuring the saturation of oxygen. When you're healthy, we have oxygen close to 100% saturation in our blood. When it starts to drop to the low 90s or 90, doctors get very concerned. So Charlotte's blood oxygen saturation was in the 70s, 72, 73%, with a ventilator that's on 100% oxygen that can't be turned up to any more force because it's blowing holes in her lungs. And we had a conversation with a doctor who said we need to start to talk about when is enough on a Saturday. So he said, come back in, both myself and Charlotte's father, come back in so that we can talk about it. We went in on Monday, and it was a different doctor. They had changed shifts, and the doctor on Monday was very familiar with Charlotte. He had been there since the night she was born. And when we sat down to talk to him, he said, I'm not convinced that she's ready for us to turn off the ventilator. She has shown us more than once already in her very young life what a fighter she is. And because of that conversation that Monday, I got some hope. And I got some hope to go back to her room and pray. And I prayed differently than I had ever prayed before. And I want you to know what happened. So first I went downstairs and to the gift shop, and I bought a little book of prayer. So it was just this big, and each page was a different prayer, a couple of lines or a paragraph. And I would sit there next to her bed and read the prayer. And at one point, I just looked up and I said, like from the depths of my soul, I said, God, you are the only one. There's nothing else that they can do. They can't turn the ventilator up at all. It's been 11 weeks of this child having this level of oxygen and being so sick. It's only you. Please, please step in. And I believed it. I believed it because I felt like I had not yet asked to that degree, that was a new ask. And because it was new, because I had shifted from reading those prayers over and over is what did it. I had shifted from the fear. For the 11 weeks, I sat next to her bed in fear. I sat next to her bed and focused on how low the numbers were and how terrible she looked and how dire the situation was. And by reading those prayers, my focus shifted to she can come through this. She will get better. God can stick his hand in and make this turn around. And here's what happened. After 11 weeks of watching that monitor, within 20 minutes of saying that prayer, where I felt different in my body, I could feel the difference of the faith. Her numbers started to move. And I'm not making this up, I promise you. There's nurses probably to this day who remember that, because I watched for a few minutes and the numbers went from 72, 73 to 75, hovered around 75, and then I saw a 76. And when it hit 77, I called the nurse, and she came in and watched with me, and then a couple of other nurses, and we stood there and we watched that monitor. And they held my hand and they had their arms on around my shoulders. And when it got into the low 80s, the nurse went and got the doctor. It had moved up 10 points in about 40 minutes after 11 weeks of no movement. And within a week, Charlotte was off that ventilator and starting to recover. After 11 weeks, she was off the ventilator. After 40 minutes, it started to shift. The only thing that changed was the depth of my prayer that came from my faith. So I wanted to share that with you today. And I'm asking you to look at, where is your faith? Is your faith in what you're afraid of? Or is your faith in what you know can happen, in the vision that you have for yourself and for your life? You have to have faith in that vision, or it has no hope of happening. So don't be like the people who lived in Jesus' hometown. Be like those who believed outside, who got the miracles.